Here we go. You are live. I get this little message that comes up that says you are live. We want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We're going to hear from April Falcon Doss as we discuss her new book, Cyber Privacy, Who Has Your Data and Why You Should Care. Whoops. As I was saying, I'm not very good at that. This book, Cyber Privacy, comes out on Tuesday. This is one of the most timely subjects that's out there, and it's one that affects virtually all of us. It can also feel like an overwhelming subject to tackle. So it's really helpful to have such a knowledgeable guide as April. So April, we thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
April has spent over a decade at the National Security Agency, where she was Associate General Counsel for Intelligence Law. She later served as Senior Minority Counsel for the Russia investigation in the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And today, April practices privacy and cybersecurity law and teaches at the University of Maryland Law School. Welcome, April.
Thank you, Irene.
Well, I wanted to just start with a personal recollection. Back in the olden times, in my old life, as many people know, I had a life before I worked at the bookstore when the internet was new. And many of us speculated and wondered, how could the internet offer services like email, news, weather, and games for free? Because we used to say things cost money, but people would say to us, that's the old model. This is the new model. As time went on, people got used to getting things for free, and we didn't want to pay for them. So we started to provide little snippets of information to continue getting what we had been getting for free. As time went on, more information was requested, and most of us gave it. We didn't really think about it. But now, perhaps with our tacit approval, and sometimes maybe without our specific approval, information is collected without us doing anything. It's scary, and it's brought us to a place where information about us and our online actions is collected, analyzed, sold, and used to predict our behavior or to influence us. April, the inside jacket of your book says your personal data is being tracked at all times across multiple platforms. If that makes you uneasy, it should. And it does for me. When did you start thinking that you wanted to do a book about this?
You know, it was a few years ago when I was getting ready to leave government. I had spent, as you mentioned, a number of years at the National Security Agency dealing with data privacy issues in a really regulated context. And now people have widely varying opinions on whether the national security community collects too much data and whether they're properly regulated. But at least there are regulations and there are statutes. But one of the things I had become really aware of as I was making that transition from government into the private sector was just how unregulated private sector data collection is. And to your point, the really rapid growth and change in technology in primarily in the last 20 years, has led to this explosion of new kinds of collection, new types of data that can be gathered, new ways that data can be combined and manipulated and used. And it's very hard for anybody to keep track of all of these changes all of the time. And so as I was looking at these things, I thought, well, for heaven's sake, I do this for a living, and it's a lot for me to keep up with. You shouldn't have to be an expert to understand what happens to your data. And so that was the motivation behind writing the book, was to try to make that information easily accessible, to put in sort of one place kind of an overview of the major kinds of data collection that's going on and the major ways that gets used, whether that's by big platform companies like social media platforms, or by employers, or by schools, or just in everyday interpersonal interactions, to make that all digestible for people so that there was sort of a handy reference people could go to and think about these things.
Well, something we were talking about earlier is just how quickly all of this changes, and technology changes, what people are doing with the data, the applications change. So as you were writing the book, did you find that you were constantly having to go back and rewrite things or add things, or were you just like, I got to get this out the door, it will never, it will never get done?
It was such a challenge. And in fact, I kept having that conversation with my editor as I was working on the manuscript. And she would have to talk me down off the ledge and say, April, you're not writing breaking news. But, for example, when I was finishing up this manuscript, it was, the springtime, the global pandemic had started. And already we could see all kinds of ways that the pandemic was leading to discussions around contact tracing and use of all kinds of surveillance for public health reasons, but also in ways that make people uneasy, depending on how those are being used. And, we may have time to talk more about that later, but it was absolutely a challenge. And so my goal in the book is to try to be very mindful about providing those broad contours so that as every new small development comes up, the basic structure is still useful. Those everyday news headlines about something having to do with privacy fit into the overall framework in the book.
Which is good. So then it can continue to be used even as the changes go on, as we know they will. I forgot to mention this at the very beginning. If folks have a question or a comment, there is a comments box on your computer. So feel free to ask us any questions, and we can, April said she'd be happy to answer them throughout our talk. So just wanted to let you know about that. Given your background, you've been on both sides of the fence, public and private. So you can talk about government surveillance and corporate surveillance. Which do you think is what we should worry more about, or should we worry about them in different ways?
It's a great question, and I think the second part of your question gets to it perfectly. We should worry about them in different ways. And so, for example, at the federal level, there are some areas in which we have really long established sets of laws and regulations to deal with some kinds of surveillance. At the National Security Agency, when you're talking about foreign intelligence surveillance under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, right? That's a framework that's been in place for a long time. There are many people who are critics of that framework, but there is an existing framework.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There are other areas of federal government surveillance where the framework's not so clearly defined. And so, for example, there's lots of concerns about data collection at the border. When you're talking about customs and border protection activities. And that includes both traditional things like searching people as they cross the border, but searching a laptop or searching a mobile phone, looking at somebody's social media history, collecting DNA at the border. There's lots of things that aren't regulated yet and that probably need to be. Again, people might disagree on how strict or lax those rules should be, but they're not as well defined. At the local law enforcement level, it varies widely by jurisdiction. So some police departments are using facial recognition. Some are using drone surveillance for crowd control and protests. Some are using mobile phone location data. Others aren't. But it varies greatly from one state and sometimes from one city or county to another. At least there, though, when we're talking any kind of government activity, there are elected officials who can be held accountable. There's any of us as a resident of our local jurisdiction can pick up the phone and call, the mayor or the city council or our senator or congressperson and express our concerns. In the corporate surveillance context, who are you going to call at Google, right? I mean, who are you going to call? I'm going to call Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. I mean, right. So that's where it's a different challenge because many of the companies that are providing the most widely used technologies and the most data intensive technologies are companies that have grown so big that they're not necessarily going to respond to concerns expressed by individual consumers, particularly to your point, consumers who are not paying some kind of subscription fee for a service, but whose data provides the basis for the company's business model.
Well, it seems that they don't necessarily even respond sometimes to concerns from their own employees. I know I've seen articles about that. As I said, I kind of started working with the internet way back in the beginning, and I remember one of the philosophies seemed to be that we would let it go and kind of see where it went, and not try to hold it down with too many regulations. And now it seems like we've gotten to the point where it's so big that it's hard to kind of wrestle control of that. And I like what you were saying, kind of differentiating that on the government side, there are some rules and regulations to kind of keep things in check, which we don't necessarily have on the corporate side. But how would you define privacy? Or how should we define privacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's such a hard one. I think of it as being, I think privacy is such an overloaded term. I mean, we have just this one word to mean a lot of different things. And so in the US legal framework, the earliest ideas of privacy had to do with either privacy of material possessions, like being free from unreasonable searches and seizures from the government, right? We have privacy in the Fourth Amendment in our persons, houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures. Or it meant that the right to be left alone. And that was an idea that came along sort of late in the 1800s in a individual context, the right not to have paparazzi peering over the fence to take pictures of, your family's, your daughter's wedding or something, right? But today, I think when we talk about privacy, we mean a lot of different things. And one of the conversations that is always so striking to me is I'll be talking with somebody and I'll hear someone say, "Oh, I'm not worried about privacy because I don't have anything to hide." And that may be true, and that's absolutely fine. But it really encompasses a lot more than that, because most of us have a sense that we want the ability to be able to share some information with some people, but not everybody, right? There's things that we would tell a few close confidants. We don't want the world to know. Those things feel private to us. There is an extent to which we want to be able to have some separation between our personal lives and our public-facing lives, our work and school and things like that. There's a degree to which our privacy is tied into our sense of autonomy and dignity and ability to move anonymously through the world. I mean, most of us wouldn't expect to be truly private when we walk down the street. We know we can be seen by whoever happens to see us, but the idea that with ubiquitous street cameras, we could be surveilled and recorded every time we walk down the street, and that data is going to live on and can show a record of our activities over time, that's kind of creepy. And that feels like a kind of privacy, even though we're in a public space when we do that. And so, so there's all these different dimensions to privacy that are all being challenged by the ways that data is collected and manipulated and used with all of these technologies that we have today.
Well, and they've also made it so that us giving up a certain amount of information makes our online experience better. It's maybe easier. It's more tailored to what we want to see. And, so it seems like if we, went in under like a stealth mode, it would be a lot more work to be in there. But that kind of ties into something else that we were, talked a little bit about earlier, in that, knowing that information about us affects what we are presented with online. And at a time right now where we're, have a hotly contested election, how does our data privacy affect the voting and elections and what we're presented with? Because I know I read about certain articles in the paper and online, but those are generally targeted towards what I already believe.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So first of all, to your point about services being improved when they know about us, Google is the dominant search engine around the world. And there are alternatives. For example, there's a search engine called DuckDuckGo, which advertises its service on the basis that it will not track your search history over time or correlate your search history with other information. But one of the reasons that services like DuckDuckGo have a harder time competing with a service like Google is that there have been studies showing that Google's searches are, any internet search is approximately 40% more effective in quickly retrieving the results that an individual wants if the platform knows something about the individual, if it's relying on personal data. And so we might say, absolutely, I want that convenience. I want to quickly find what I'm looking for, and I'm totally okay with Google knowing all kinds of things about me. That's a-okay. My view is just that people should know that about the services. So so absolutely, having that personal data often makes the services. That's how the platforms and apps and device providers really kind of justify this business model, saying, well, we can give consumers the service that they want. We can provide a better user experience. And in many cases, people do find that user experience better. They just may not have much choice, right? But back to your question about the elections. So, I had the most interesting set of conversations the other day. I was on a email listserv exchange with a bunch of people who all teach law school classes in internet law and privacy and things like that. And we were talking about election disinformation and election interference. And talking about the things that pop up in people's Facebook feeds. And you probably know that Facebook has come under a great deal of criticism, as have YouTube and other platforms, for having algorithms that will serve up extremist content to people. And there was some Wall Street Journal reporting back in recently saying that in 2017, Facebook's own research had shown that of the people who migrated to extremist groups on the platform, something like 2/3 of those people went to those groups because Facebook's own algorithm recommended that content. And the reason that those recommendations happen is because of the personal data that the platforms have about us. So if you think back to the 2016 election cycle, of course, there was concern then about election interference from the Russian government, and in the many sort of investigations and postmortems that happened from that, one of the things that came to light was the company Cambridge Analytica and their use of Facebook data. And I promise this story is going to answer your question. I promise. And so what had happened was Cambridge Analytica was one of a number of apps and users that were looking at Facebook data as part of creating basically detailed personal profiles of individuals, not just the things that we post on our Facebook pages, like where we live or our relationship status or, photos from the place we just visited. The places we used to visit. But also things like a person's personality traits. So how somebody rates on that ocean score of, openness and neuroticism and a tendency towards authoritarianism and these personality inventories. And so the allegations are that Cambridge Analytica and others were able to use that to say, these kind of people want authoritarian content or are prone to authoritarianism, let's steer them towards content that is going to appeal to that messaging. Separately, we know from the indictments from Robert Mueller's investigation, we know that the Internet Research Agency that was operating on behalf of the Russian intelligence services in 2016 created Facebook pages and content designed to appeal to people based on their interest, whether they were politically, from a US perspective, right-leaning or left-leaning. People's interest in issues like immigration or border security or any number of issues. And that information does not pop up randomly in our feeds. So this is where, in my very long story here, I'm going to get back to the point about the discussion with these other law professors. We were talking about content moderation on platforms and whether and what platforms should do to try to address disinformation and manipulation of information on social media and places like that. And a number of folks in this discussion said, well, if I see something pop in my Facebook feed and it's an advertisement from, a political campaign, isn't that just the same as if one of my friends had decided to send me an email about it? And I thought, oh my heavens, no, it's not the same at all. And the reason I thought, oh my heavens, is because these are people who are, immersed in studying these issues, but not understanding how the technology works. So in a social media feed, what you see is not, yes, you might see things that are posted by your friends, but the order in which you see them and the frequency with which you see them and how much other content you see, whether it's paid or unpaid, is tied to algorithms that know an awful lot about you and me and our activities online, on and off the platform, and have made a decision, oh, I think April's going to be interested in this. Maybe I can change Eileen's mind about something if I give her this. And so it's not at all straightforward. And those algorithms are making decisions in what they serve that are inherently changing what we think, because they're popping up content that we might not have spontaneously been thinking about.
Right. They're bubbling it up to us.
That's right. And they're doing it based on what they know about us. And that's the piece where the data privacy comes in, is that what makes that so effective is those platforms know so much about us. They know not just our interests, but a lot about our personalities and behaviors and inclinations and the kinds of things that will appeal to us individually. And that's very different than traditional marketing in the level of detail that's now available about people.
Well, I think, one of the things that Facebook and some of the other companies have said in the past is that they're agnostic is not the right word, but they are merely communicating information. They are not trying to influence people, and they're not creating the content. They're just kind of a funnel. But as you're saying, the algorithms that they create, which, use our information to decide what to present us, really are influencing us, even if it's not necessarily a deliberate attempt to influence us one way or the other, but by presenting us constantly with information that fits along with our profile. They're reinforcing things that we believe and and presenting us with things that are along those lines without any check on the veracity of all the information that they're giving us. So one of the other areas where this is, definitely a hot button right now is in the area of people's perceptions about COVID and mask wearing and vaccines. And that's just not something I guess I thought health things. I'm like, how would they know about, my beliefs on health or vaccines? But again, privacy issues.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things that we know about the social media platform sort of model is the saying, if it enrages, it engages, and since the model really is tied to making money from advertising and being able to make more money if the platforms can keep people's eyeballs on the screen, they know that things that make us fearful or angry will keep us engaged. And they know a lot about each of us individually in order to figure out what will make us fearful or engaged, or excuse me, enraged. And so YouTube, for example, has been widely criticized because of the way that its algorithms float up, or had been floating up, conspiracy theories, extremist content, pandemic hoax videos, anti-masker stuff, right? The entire QAnon conspiracy theory would not have taken hold in American society the way it has, probably, were it not for social media really causing that to proliferate. So you had mentioned, Eileen, a few minutes ago, back in the old days of the internet, when people had this idea that it was going to be sort of this almost utopian framework, right? We can get all these things for free and people will connect around the world. And those things are true. But one of the things I'm so struck by is in the early days of the internet, I think people saw it as a force for good and saw it almost as something that could sort of float above society and be a realm of, kind of pure thought with no consequences. Just, people could be free to be their true selves and whatnot. And what we see now is things that happen on the internet have very real world consequences. And sometimes the anonymity on the internet, sometimes we don't really have it when we think we do. And sometimes when people do have anonymity on the internet, they use it in ways that are actually incredibly destructive to others because they can hide behind that anonymity and targeting other people. So lots of real, kind of challenges. It's like that meme, how it started, how it's going. You know what I mean? Very different.
We talked a little bit earlier about the, defining privacy, but would you say that there are like different levels of privacy and protection that we should worry about? Are there certain things where, it's okay if everybody knows that? And there are things that, no, we definitely need to keep private, or is it really all of it, everything about ourselves we should try to keep control of, I guess, as much as we can?
It's a great question. And I think my perspective on it is that we should all be sufficiently informed to make those choices in a very personal way. So, for example, some kinds of information is just generally protected. So things like social security numbers and credit card information, things like that. There's lots of laws that say that if somebody is in possession of that, they have to protect it. And that's why we all get all these data breach notifications every time there's a new hack at, Nordstrom or Home Depot or, wherever. But then there's a really wide range of information where people, I think very appropriately, have a different comfort level, right? I mean, some parents with young kids put lots of content out on the internet from the time their children are very young, photos and videos of their kids as babies and toddlers, and here's all the celebrations and, family events. Other people who say, I don't want any of that out there because it feels creepy to me that there could be strangers who could see that. Even if I post it intending it to go just to friends, it could get shared or spread to somebody else.
Right.
But those are the kinds of information that we generally are being intentional about. And there's so much more data collection that I think we often don't know is happening. And so, for example, when I think about things like location data, all of us now are carrying around smartphones most of the time. If you think about this, the first iPhone came out in 2007. So before that, we were not in the habit of having, a precision geolocation device on our person at all times and all places. And no matter what kind of phone you have, if it's a smartphone, it is going to be pinging cell phone towers and geolocating your mostly on cell phones, but through other technologies also, your precise location at all times of day. It might be beaconing out thousands of times in a day. You might know that information is going to your phone company. You probably suspect it is. You might not be thinking about that information going to Apple and to Google. You might not be thinking about it going to all of the apps that you've downloaded from the App Store or from Google Play. And you might be wondering how it is that, again, in the before times when we were all going places more often, pre-COVID, people would wonder, like, how am I getting these advertisements for this restaurant, right? And the answer, of course, is because we're generating this location data all the time. And so those are the kinds of things, a very different example would be all of the health and fitness apps, fitness trackers. They keep track of where we run or how many steps we take, or the apps that women will use to track their periods, or that couples will use when they're trying to get pregnant. That data is not covered by health privacy laws, right? When we go to the doctor's office and we sign in for an appointment, and then the office personnel will, tear off the little adhesive tape so that nobody can see who signed in for their appointment. That's covered by HIPAA.
Right.
But the information we're putting in our health tracking apps, which might include blood sugar or blood pressure or periods or, or sexual activity or, all kinds of things, that's not protected in law. And one of the many scandals that's happened with Facebook over time has been the discovery that many of these apps that people were installing on their phones for that kind of behavior were sharing the data with Facebook. Many people wouldn't have known that in using those apps. And so those kinds of questions are the ones that I think are a little bit harder to get at. And again, it's a very personal decision. Am I comfortable with this company having my data, if it's going to be this kind of data? And do I understand who else they might share it with and how it might be?
Right.
Those are the things that are hard to get at.
I was going to say, I know I go through my phone periodically and, look at, you can set whether it has certain apps have access to, your location or things like that. And I adjust those to what I think they should be. I don't know if I believe that they actually follow all that, but I know way back when, the phones didn't used to be able to tell very closely where you were. And when I was working at a mobile company, at the time they were working on instituting the 911 system for mobile phones, they had to really make the location aspects of these very precise, obviously, for a 911 call. But in so doing, they also then allowed you to be pinpointed, wherever you are. And I think one of the concerns, that you brought up is about the privacy of your information when you're using certain apps. And I know people have some concerns sometimes about their health data perhaps being at some point along the line passed along to their insurance company or to their employer, who may perhaps based on, activities that they're undertaking, might decide that they need to make changes in their insurance. So I think, it's hard for any of us to track what happens to, our data along the line as it gets sold. It's like we lose control over our personal information, which is exactly what you're talking about in your book.
Yeah, we do, and it's funny. This is an issue that comes up in so many contexts. Genetic information, of course, is another area that is raising a whole host of new challenges. It's another very recent development. I mean, if you think about it, 20 years ago, the idea of mapping the human genome was a moonshot. I mean, that was a huge sort of technological endeavor. Now, for $99, we can do a cheek swab and send a sample off to a number of companies, Ancestry or MyDNA, or, to do DNA samples sort of for fun, for genealogical research. Sometimes it involves some health assessment. And as you said, there's a lot of questions around a couple of different areas of use. One is in the employment context. If employers have access to that genetic information, some employer wellness programs will offer discounts. You get, or incentives of some kind, a free gym membership or a reduced cost on health insurance or something if you provide genetic information. Of course, the genetic information is seldom going to say whether somebody has a condition. Sometimes it will, and that in itself is, raises questions. Sometimes it's just a propensity, an increased risk for something. What does that really mean in terms of the workplace ethics for employers to be asking for that kind of data? It's certainly not prohibited under law right now. Separately, one of the examples that I write about in the book is the example of the Golden State Killer, the arrest in this cold case made on DNA analysis. And Joseph D'Angelo, the man who has now pled guilty and been sentenced to life in prison, multiple consecutive life sentences for this string of just horrific rapes and murders in California in the 70s and 80s. He was arrested not because he had done a DNA test, but because he had relatives who had.
Yeah.
And so when any of us sign up for any of the private DNA testing services, we are necessarily giving up information, not just about ourselves, but about people that we're related to by blood. And that may be used by law enforcement. It may be used in other ways, and raises all kinds of personal issues. Fascinating instances of everything from things that can be traumatic within a family, as people discover that somebody must have had an affair along the way because of the genetic differences between siblings. That can be very distressing. Not everybody wants to know that. And also, just interesting things that happen on chat boards as people who, there've been some interesting stories about people who are in white supremacist groups who get back DNA results that suggest that their ancestry is more mixed than they thought. And then they get into these chats with other people in the group saying, but I feel like I know what I am. And it creates this cognitive dissonance. There's all kinds of things that happen from this new information as people get it and have to grapple with its meaning.
Just discussing all of this and the many, many ways our information can be used and abused, and how it can be shared, not even by ourselves, but by someone else. That indirectly affects us. It does seem overwhelming, and do we need to all go run off and live in the woods and be off the grid and just stop all our social media, turn off the geolocator on our phones, erase all of our apps? What should we do? Can we do something? And then I guess, kind of as a follow-on about that, are there steps or things that we should do or can do to either help us gain control or to help there be some kind of guidance or regulations to protect us all? Oh, and then, see, Sally has a great question here too. I don't know if you want to answer this now, but Sally Palstian, one of our longtime favorite customers, actually wants to know how data sharing can exacerbate power dynamics, like identifying people, as you mentioned earlier, with surveillance, identifying people who attend protests, or health data for people with pre-existing conditions, or cultures who don't want their genetics shared because of historical bad acting. Are people who have power less likely to worry about data sharing, which I think is also an interesting question. So do you want to jump to Sally's question and then we'll get back to the other one?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great questions. I will first say, though, that I get the temptation to run away to the woods. It's always my favorite vacation is always one where I am, out of range of any signal. But spoiler alert, we don't have to do that every day. to deal with these privacy issues. But no, Sally, to your questions, actually, there's a whole section in the book that talks exactly about power dynamics. Some of the ones that you point to in your question, things like, potential infringements on First Amendment rights of assembly and speech and protest. When you have drone surveillance or facial recognition or cell phone geolocation to track who's protesting where, that can have a very chilling effect and be really detrimental to our national values. And when you talk about things like pre-existing conditions and genetic, other kinds of genetic information, that can be used in very harmful and damaging ways also, but also some other things we haven't talked about yet. For example, in the context of employers and schools, right? Even before we went to so much remote work and so much remote learning, we were already seeing things like facial recognition applications in schools being used, not just to see which students were present and who was ducking down the hallway to, cut class, but in classrooms to measure student engagement, almost infringing on freedom of thought in a sense, with facial recognition technology that is purporting to measure how well students are paying attention or whether they're daydreaming, or purporting to measure how effective a teacher is and evaluate teachers based on that. Now what we see with so much remote learning is test taking and other technologies that are, students have a camera on them surveilling them while they're taking a test. And it feels intrusive. The student knows that if they were in a classroom with a human proctor and watching over them to make sure they weren't passing notes, that they would be watched. But there is something different about knowing that it's being recorded and surveilled, and that information lasts. In the employment context, there have been lots of complaints about companies, for instance, complaints from warehouse workers at Amazon, saying that their location is tracked precisely, within a couple of foot radius in everywhere they are throughout the warehouse. Many employers have searched people as they go in and out of business locations, but now there's video surveillance. People are wearing, if you go into a retail establishment and somebody's wearing a headset, to be able to call, hey, I need more help at the cash register. Some of those also are recording the things that the employer or the employee is saying. Sometimes ID badges are listening to the tone and timbre and volume of voice to make assessments about the person's emotional state. We even have people now, early adopters of technology, who are volunteering to get RFID chips implanted under their skin to use, I know, right? To use as a key fob to swipe into work or to unlock your computer. And so there's lots of ways that these technologies can really reinforce existing power imbalances in dangerous ways. And it happens at the interpersonal level also. One of the things that I write about in the book is stalkerware, which is, sort of the surreptitiously installed software, usually on a cell phone, could be on some other kind of device, that is keeping track of somebody's location, their keystrokes, who they're texting, who they're emailing. It's called stalkerware because it's most often used in abusive relationships or by exes who want to find out what their former spouse or significant other is doing. So it can be really, it can be a way of leveraging power over an individual by literally stalking them through a device. It's illegal, but it is highly common and widely used. Of course, the other area we really see this play out in, most often in gender dynamics and intimate relationships, is in the context of revenge porn and deep fakes, where somebody takes either real photos or videos that, in an intimate setting, sex tapes or, topless photos or nude photos, and post them on the internet to name and shame somebody. Or they take a real photo of somebody's face usually somebody that they had a former relationship with, usually a woman. It's usually women who are the victims of this, and sort of digitally paste it onto somebody else's body and create fake videos and fake photos, but put them out there as if they're real. And it has the same effect of, humiliating the woman or the person. It's sometimes men. And undermining their reputation at work and in the community and so forth. And it's another kind of power dynamic in which personal data is really at the heart of how this is done. So there's so many aspects of data and power that are really significant, and that I try to look at, in the book. So to the question about are people with power less likely to worry about data sharing, I think generally there's an extent to which it is true and an extent to which they have the resources not to be concerned. So in some respects, it's, I think, a reality that there are all kinds of ways in which people who have means and resources and power in society are insulated from many concerns that, sort of all the rest of us have, right? I mean, in the sense that if you are powerful, if you have great means and resources, if somebody uses your data in a way that is without your consent or is going to violate some kind of law or something, you have the means most likely to take some action against them. But it is also true that many people who are in particularly prominent or wealthy or powerful positions hire people whose whole job is to secure their information, to make sure that whether it's their phones or their laptops or their computer network or their social media presence, that is carefully protected and managed, so that what's visible to others is curated, and anything that's potentially sensitive gets protected. So it's a great question. And that was a really long answer.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's that kind of relates a little bit to what we were going down the path to answering before, which is, not about going and hiding in the woods, but that it can be overwhelming. And most of us are not like those really rich people who have somebody who can, continually be monitoring our online presence and our privacy. And so what can we do? And, I think, sometimes it feels like it's whack-a-mole. Like you take care of one thing, but something comes up somewhere else. So, from a systemic perspective, what should we be doing? And I know from our talk earlier, you mentioned that states have kind of been taking the lead on this, and actually have, some of them are very progressive about having laws about it. And so that might be, the method that we funnel our attention to. But let me let you talk about what we can do so that we don't all feel depressed about how our information is out there everywhere, and we can't do anything about it.
That's right. We should run off to the woods because we want to, not because we feel like we have to.
Exactly.
Right. It's a great question, and I think of it in two ways. What can we do in our personal lives, and what can we do in our community and society?
Yes.
And I think in both of those areas, the answer starts in the same place. It starts with, philosophically, what do you care about? And so I try really hard in the book to make sure that I'm looking at lots of dimensions of privacy. Government use of data, private sector use of data, the big platforms, the employers in schools, all these things, because different people will care about different things. For somebody who cares a lot about, for example, issues of private sector use of data, they might want to find out in the social and community sense. They might want to say, okay, I care a lot about government use of data. Let me find out in my city and county and state, what are police allowed to do with facial recognition or with gathering records from Ring or, other kinds of, the home video surveillance programs that so many people have that are uploaded to a cloud. Lots of police departments have contracts for access to that data. If I live in a community where my police department has that access, am I comfortable with that? Or do I want to raise a protest through my local government about that kind of use? At the federal level, I mean, Northern Virginia, we all think about, DC and Congress, and that's a really important thing to think about. But Eileen, to your point, lots of these laws and protections are starting at the local and state level and then bubbling their way up to Congress. So California has what is probably the most wide-ranging framework for data privacy of any of the 50 states right now. And so the California Consumer Privacy Act, which took effect at the beginning of 2020, and really kind of adopts a lot of the European view that privacy is a fundamental right and people should be able to have access to their data and so forth. The California Act affects so many companies that now many of the major tech platforms, Google and Facebook and Amazon and others, who had resisted national privacy legislation in the past, now are saying, you know what, it's going to be really hard if we have to deal with 50 different laws in 50 different states. Congress, actually, we're open to having a federal privacy law now. So it's really changed the conversation. So sometimes those steps that start at the state and local level can be really impactful, both locally and nationally over time. So that's kind of on the community and social kind of front. And then on the personal front, it's really the same set of questions. Philosophically, what are the things I care about? And then tangibly, what are the things I can do? And, somebody had done a survey recently looking at, those privacy policies we all see on every app that we download.
We all just click on.
Right. And the study had shown that for the average user, if they were to actually read all of those policies, it would take like 72 days or something like that, which is why nobody reads them. And so I wouldn't suggest, you have to go through a 37-point program to clean all your apps and devices and read all your privacy policies. But I would say, think about which things you really care about and focus on those. You might decide that what you really care about is you really want to be sure that when you post things like videos or photos or comments on social media, you really want to keep that within your circle of friends. So really pay attention to all the social media apps that you use. What are your privacy settings just on those platforms, just to be sure that you're doing what you intend to do, right? You might really not like the idea that every app on your phone knows where you are all the time. That's when it's fairly simple. Just look and see, do all of your apps have location services on? Maybe you don't need to have them all on. Maybe you can turn it off on a lot of them, because maybe your guitar tuner app doesn't need to know where you're tuning your guitar, right? You just need to hear the sounds. So there's some really simple things like that people can do. Again, first from the idea, which issues do I care about? And then focus on taking some simple actions in those areas.
I wanted to, Chris asked a question about something that you and I had discussed before we started the call, which was the, difference between, the US and Europe and how we look at privacy. And he is actually then talking about Chinese apps. So a question about data privacy beyond the US, is there more or less protection in Europe, saying using a European website or versus an American website? And what about Chinese apps like TikTok?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the main difference with Europe under the European General Data Protection Regulation is that data can only be collected if there's what the law calls a lawful basis. And then once data has been collected, anybody whose data has been collected, who's a European resident, has the right to ask for a copy of it or have it deleted or corrected, things like that. As a practical matter, when it comes to things like visiting websites or using apps, it often doesn't really provide a meaningful difference in privacy protection to the US, because typically when you go to one of those websites or you use one of those apps, you are in fact consenting to have that data collected. You could later decide that you want to delete it, and under European law, that's a right that goes beyond what most places in the US require. There's some requirements under California law, but otherwise not widespread. So functionally, there's not a huge difference, because generally, most of the time our data is collected with permission that says it can be used by this website or app. And then there's usually some language about, and it may be shared with partners. And that's where it becomes opaque very quickly. When it comes to China and Russia and a few other countries, however, it really is different in the sense that China is one of a couple of countries, like Russia, that have data localization laws that require all data to be shared or shareable with the government. And so one of the sections towards the end of the book that talks about a comparison of privacy in different countries around the world looks at some of those sort of very surveillance-heavy, sort of more authoritarian kind of regimes. And that's been part of the concern about TikTok, is that because of the Chinese legal requirement that all that data be shareable with Chinese government, data that's being posted on TikTok, user information gathered by TikTok, which could be user information on other apps on the same device, other user information, not just what you do in that platform, then has to be shared under Chinese law with the Chinese government. So, so that's where the privacy difference comes in. There's only a couple of countries that require that heavy, sort of very intrusive government surveillance.
And that wouldn't be something that you would be able to opt out of.
That's right.
Because it's the law.
Yeah. Your choice is use TikTok or not.
Yeah. 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 We are pretty much out of time.
The hour flew.
I know. Well, you know, again, oops, I'm still not good at this. April's new book is Cyber Privacy: Who Has Your Data and Why You Should Care. It's an essential guidebook to, you know, understanding and trying to maintain a grip on your personal information. And as April pointed out, to decide what is important to you. But she does talk about just so many different applications in here. It's also very accessible. I think that probably comes from you being a professor. But it comes out on Tuesday. April will be coming into the store to sign books. So if you'd like a signed copy, you can order one on the website. Thank you, April, so much for taking your time out this evening and educating us. And I think I'm going to go look and see what the laws are here in Virginia about stuff, just to start to educate myself, because I, you know, don't want to turn off all of my devices. And while I would like to live in the woods and off the grid, I'd like that to be a choice, not a fearful response to what's going on. So thank you again. And thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. And that is it. Have a great evening.
Thanks so much, Eileen. It's been a pleasure.
It was a lot of fun.